The paramedics were already lifting my son-in-law onto the gurney when I heard him say it. I fell. 2 words. A lie so smooth it barely disturbed the air around it. But I was standing 8 feet away, and I had watched the entire thing happen. He hadn't fallen. My daughter had put him there. Some details in this story have been changed to protect the people involved. But everything that matters, every choice, every consequence, happened exactly the way I'm about to tell you. 20 minutes earlier, I was standing near the dessert table at my daughter's wedding reception, holding a glass of champagne I hadn't touched, watching my son-in-law's mother tell the caterer their vegan option was underwhelming. I remember thinking that was the biggest problem any of us had that night. I was wrong. My name is Adaeze. I'm 58 years old. My neighbors think I'm a retired logistics consultant who spends his weekends fixing up an old Buick in the garage. That's true, as far as it goes. It just isn't the whole truth. For 19 years before that, I worked in a field that doesn't show up on a resume, the kind of work where you learn to read a room before you walk into it, and to notice the one detail that doesn't fit, because that detail is usually the one that gets someone hurt. I retired clean. I thought that part of my life was finished. I have one daughter, Adaeze. Her mother left us when Adaeze was 9, and I raised her alone from a rented townhouse in Charlotte, North Carolina, working double shifts and reading bedtime stories over the phone from airports. I wasn't allowed to name. She grew into someone sharper than I ever was, a supply chain auditor now, 29 years old, the kind of person who finds the one line item in a 1,000-page contract that doesn't add up. She gets that from me. I like to think she gets her patience from her mother. The first time I met Desmond Farrow, he shook my hand a beat too long, smiled a beat too wide, and asked me, over dinner, what my daughter stood to inherit. Not directly. He wrapped it in a question about family financial planning. But I've spent enough years reading people to know when a question has a second question hiding inside it. I told him Adaeze had worked for everything she owned and intended to keep it that way. He laughed like I'd made a joke. I hadn't. That night, I called an old contact of mine, a woman named Priscilla Nakemdarim, now a forensic accountant who used to work adjacent to the kind of world I came from. I asked her to look into Desmond Farrow's business, quietly. 4 days later, she called me back and said 6 words that changed the shape of everything. You need to see this now. What she found wasn't a rumor. It was a pattern. Desmond ran an investment consultancy that, on paper, managed retirement portfolios for older clients in 3 states. In reality, it was structured almost entirely on new deposits, paying out old withdrawals, the kind of arrangement that only survives as long as nobody asks to see the underlying assets, because there aren't any. 41 names on his client roster, most of them retired. One of them, a 71-year-old former nurse named Adaeze Ferreira, had put in nearly $200,000 her entire pension buyout. I asked Priscilla why we couldn't go to the authorities immediately. She told me the case wasn't strong enough yet, that regulators needed the paper trail fully documented, or Desmond would simply move the remaining funds somewhere untouchable before anyone could freeze them. I asked the only question that actually mattered to me in that moment. My daughter marries him in 5 weeks. What do I tell her? Priscilla was quiet for a long moment before she answered. Nothing yet. Not until we can protect her financially and legally at the same time we protect everyone else. So I said nothing. I drove home that night, sat in my kitchen with the lights off, and stared at a wedding invitation with my daughter's new last name printed on it in gold foil, a name that wasn't going to stay clean much longer, and she had no idea. I want you to sit with that feeling for a second, because it's the feeling this entire story is built on. Knowing something is coming for someone you love, and knowing that saying it too soon could destroy the only chance you have to actually stop it. If you've ever had to carry a secret like that, waiting, watching, protecting someone from a distance, I want to hear about it. And if you're ready for this journey with me, tell me where in the world you're watching this from down in the comments. Hit that like button, subscribe to Roman's Revenge Stories, and turn on notifications, because this story only gets heavier from here, and you will not want to miss a single chapter. Because 5 weeks later, at Adaeze's own wedding, everything I'd been holding back was about to come out in front of 30 guests, and Desmond Farrow had no idea what was waiting for him. Weddings have a way of making everyone perform. The mothers perform grace, the fathers perform pride. And I stood in the back of that reception hall in Charlotte, in a rented tuxedo, performing the role of a proud father while carrying a folder in my car that could end the marriage before the cake was even cut. Have you ever had to smile through something you knew was about to fall apart? Not a guess, not a fear. Something you knew, with documents to prove it. Tell me honestly in the comments, could you have kept smiling? Adaeze wore her mother's pearl earrings that day. Small, simple, the only piece of jewelry I'd kept after her mother passed. When I saw them catch the light during the ceremony, I nearly lost the composure I'd spent 19 years training myself to hold on to. Desmond cried during his vows, convincingly, right up until the moment his eyes flicked toward the exit doors while the officiant was still speaking. Nobody else caught it. I did. Reading a room was the one skill nobody ever had to teach me twice. His mother, a sharp-featured woman named Carlotta, found me near the bar afterward. She looked at my tuxedo, my posture, the way I was standing slightly apart from the crowd, and said, "Adaeze is lucky to have such a devoted father." I thought about Adaeze Ferreira's $200,000 sitting somewhere in an account with Desmond's name on it, and I said, "She makes it easy." Carlotta's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She knew something about her son. She just didn't know how much I already knew. 3 days after the wedding, Priscilla called with 2 words that told me the waiting was almost over. Delaware connection. She'd traced the shell entity Desmond used to move client funds, a corporation registered in Delaware, with no employees, no offices, nothing but a mailbox and Desmond's signature on the incorporation papers. It was the final piece regulators needed. But before regulators could move, something else moved first. 7 days after the wedding, Adaeze called me at 6 in the morning. Her voice had that careful, controlled flatness I recognized instantly, because it was the same voice I used to use on calls I didn't want anyone listening in on. If someone moved money out of a joint account without telling their spouse, she said, what would that even look like? It wasn't a hypothetical. We both knew it. I told her to document everything before she said a single word to Desmond. Check the numbers twice. Screenshot everything. Don't confront him until she had proof that couldn't be argued away. What she didn't tell me until later that week was what she'd actually found. 3 transfers, $11,000, $9,000, $7,000, moving out of their joint account into something called Faro Strategic Holdings, an account she'd never seen before, never agreed to, never signed for. She confronted him over breakfast. He told her it was routine capital repositioning, promised paperwork he never produced. That evening, she called me again, and this time her voice wasn't flat anymore. It was thin, stretched, the voice of someone standing on ice that had just started cracking beneath her. "Do you still have that accountant's number?" she asked. I gave her Priscilla's information without hesitation. And then Adaeze said something that I still think about. "I learned to double-check everything from you, you know. I just didn't think I'd ever need it for this." I had to set the phone down for a moment after that call, not because I was surprised, because some part of me had been protecting her from this exact conversation for 5 weeks, and now she was walking into it with her eyes open, on her own, without me having to say a single word. Has anyone in your life ever surprised you by handling something you thought you'd have to handle for them? Let me know below. I think that moment tells you more about a person than almost anything else can. There was a dinner party already scheduled for 3 weeks out, one of those events you can't gracefully cancel without questions. Adaeze's co-workers, a few of Desmond's business associates, his mother, his college friends, 40 invitations sent before any of this had come to light. Adaeze decided not to cancel it. I didn't know, at the time, what she was planning to do with that room full of people. I found out the same night everyone else did. A neighbor of theirs, a woman named Beatrix Solano, stood near the drink table that evening, recording a video message for her daughter overseas, the way she did at most gatherings, half out of habit and half because she liked narrating her life to someone far away. She was still recording when the room went completely silent. Adaeze set down her wine glass. "There are a few things everyone here should probably know," she said. If you've ever watched someone you love find their voice at exactly the right moment, you know there's nothing else quite like it. Have you ever seen someone stand up for themselves in a room full of people who didn't expect it? I want to hear that story in the comments. Because what Adaeze said next didn't just expose Desmond Faro, it ended him. Silence has a texture when it happens in a room full of people who weren't expecting it. You can feel it settle over the furniture, over the glasses of wine going warm in people's hands, over the 40 faces turning toward one woman standing near the drink table with nothing but the truth in her hands. Adaeze didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She spoke the way she does when she's presenting an audit finding to a room of executives who'd rather she found nothing. Calm, sequential, unshakable. Several of you have invested money with Faro Strategics, she said. I need you to know what I found. She laid it out in under 2 minutes. The transfers, the shell account in Delaware, the 41 names on client lists that didn't match the assets actually being held. She didn't raise her voice once. She didn't have to, because Desmond raised his for her. You have no idea what you're doing, he said, crossing the room toward her, his voice dropping into something between wounded and threatening, the tone of a man who has never once in his life been told no by someone he thought he owned. Adaeze didn't step back. She's 5'4". He had nearly a foot on her, and she looked at him and said, I have a very clear idea. That's the problem for you. Have you ever watched someone stand their ground against a person who was used to controlling them? There's a specific kind of courage in that, not the loud kind, the quiet kind. Tell me in the comments if you've ever had to find that kind of courage for yourself. His hand came up fast. The sound of it landing echoed through a room that had gone completely still. For one suspended second, Adaeze didn't move, not from shock, but from something closer to recognition, like she was cataloging the moment rather than reacting to it. Then he lunged at her. And every early morning I'd spent teaching her how to fall, how to redirect weight that wasn't hers to carry, took over completely. She pivoted, redirected his momentum instead of absorbing it. His shoulder caught the corner of a hardwood console table on the way down, and the crack of it was audible across the entire room. Carlotta screamed that Adaeze had attacked her son. I stepped forward, the flattest, quietest voice I own, the one I hadn't used in almost 2 decades, and told everyone to stay exactly where they were, to call for an ambulance, not to touch anything. In the corner, Beatrix Solano slowly lowered her phone. She had never stopped recording. The ambulance arrived within minutes. As they wheeled Desmond past me on the gurney, he looked at me once. Not with pain, with calculation. Like he was already 3 steps ahead, already building the version of this story he intended to tell. He told the paramedic simply, I fell. That's where I started this story with you, that lie, spoken so smoothly it barely disturbed the air. I stood there and watched him say it, and I understood in that exact moment that this wasn't over. It was only the beginning of a much longer fight. Adaeze documented everything that night. Every screenshot backed up, every detail written down while it was still fresh, exactly the way I'd once trained people to do it for a living, though I'd never expected to be teaching my own daughter the same lessons under these circumstances. 2 days later came the gut punch neither of us saw coming. Desmond filed for an emergency protective order against Adaeze, granted on his account alone, before anyone had heard hers. I explained to her, as calmly as I could manage, that it wasn't a conviction. It was a temporary measure built entirely on his version of events, a version he'd started constructing on the gurney the moment he said those 2 lying words. Have you ever done everything right, only to watch the truth get twisted the moment someone else got there first? That feeling of being punished for defending yourself is one of the loneliest feelings there is. If you've ever experienced that, I want you to tell me about it below, because I think more people carry that story than we realize. 4 days after the protective order, Adaeze called me from a parking garage, her voice shaking in a way I hadn't heard since she was a teenager. Someone had smashed the driver's side window of her car. Sitting on the seat, weighted down by broken glass, was a note. Drop everything, or next time it won't be the window. I was in my car within 90 seconds. I drove the 18 minutes to reach her faster than I've driven anywhere in years, photographing everything the way I'd been trained to the moment I arrived, and called a detective I'd built a working relationship with during the early stages of this case, a sharp, no-nonsense investigator named Corinne Adaeze, who had a unit at that garage within 15 minutes of my call. In the car afterward, Adaeze finally asked me the question she'd been circling for weeks without letting herself say it out loud. What did you actually used to do, Dad, before all of this? And for the first time in her entire life, I told her the truth. Plainly, no softening it. I spent a long time making sure people like you stayed safe. She gripped my hand and didn't let go for a long time. If someone you loved asked you to finally tell them the truth about who you really are, would you be ready to answer? I think that's a question worth sitting with. Let me know your honest answer in the comments. I read every single one. Because 2 nights later, someone would throw a rock through my own front window. And that was the moment this story stopped being about protecting my daughter from a distance and became something far more personal. 2 nights after the incident in the parking garage, I woke to the sound of glass breaking, not shattering completely, a single, sharp crack, the kind that comes from something thrown hard and deliberate. By the time I reached my front room, the rock was already resting against my bookshelf, and my car door outside had been keyed with a word I won't repeat here. I want you to imagine that feeling for a second. You've spent your whole life being the one who protects other people. And then, for the first time in almost 20 years, someone brings the danger straight to your own front door. How would that change the way you saw the rest of the fight? I genuinely like to know. Tell me below. I'd installed a camera on my porch the morning after Adaze's car window was smashed. Some instinct telling me this wasn't finished. That instinct paid off. The footage caught a man's face clearly under the street lamp for almost 3 full seconds before he ran. Detective Adaeze identified him within hours. His name was Ferris Okonjo Adaeze, a man with a minor record and a known connection to a low-level enforcer named Titus Broadnax, operating out of a neighborhood 2 towns over. Someone had hired them. 2 new charges layered on top of everything else: criminal threatening, witness intimidation. What none of us expected was how quickly that thread would start to unravel Desmond's entire operation from the inside. The same week, 2 things landed on Detective Adaeze's desk within hours of each other. The first was a phone call from Beatrix Solano. She had the full, unedited footage from the dinner party, 4 minutes and 17 seconds, time-stamped, showing every second of what happened between Desmond and Adaeze that night, from the first accusation to the moment he hit her. "I wasn't going to sit on something that could help someone who deserved to be believed," she told Adaeze when she handed the footage over in person. Have you ever had a neighbor, a co-worker, a near stranger step up for you in a moment when the people closest to you couldn't? That kind of unexpected loyalty stays with you. If that's ever happened to you, I want to hear that story in the comments. Those are some of my favorite ones to read. The second discovery ran even deeper. Detective Adaeze ran Desmond's legal name through interstate court records and found something none of us had known to look for: a legal name change filed years earlier in Suffolk County from Marlon Yancey Petrosian to Desmond Farrow. Beneath that filing sat an expired protective order filed by a woman named Selassie Van Tongeren, citing financial control and physical intimidation during an argument about money moved without her knowledge. It had happened before, to someone else, long before Adaeze had ever met him. That detail changed something in me. I had spent 19 years learning to recognize patterns, the way certain kinds of harm repeat themselves, quietly, across different names and different cities, until someone finally stops long enough to connect them. Desmond wasn't a man who had simply made one terrible mistake with my daughter. He was a man following a blueprint he'd already used once before on someone who never got the chance to be believed. Meanwhile, Titus Broadnax, the man who had orchestrated the intimidation against both Adaeze and me, had been receiving payments through a Farrow strategic subsidiary account and, likely sensing where this was all heading, had recorded several of his calls with Desmond as a form of personal insurance. One recording, made 11 days before my window was broken, captured Desmond's voice with chilling clarity. Just scare them enough to make them back off. I don't care how you do it. About his own daughter-in-law. About me. I remember sitting in Detective Adaeze's office, listening to that recording play through a small speaker, and feeling something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not fear, but a kind of cold, focused clarity. The same clarity I used to feel right before a job shifted from routine into something that required my full attention. Within days, the Securities and Exchange Commission issued an emergency asset freeze against Farrow Strategic Holdings and its Delaware shell entity. Every account connected to Desmond went cold overnight. Titus Broadnax's payments stopped instantly, and when he tried calling Desmond afterward, every call went straight to voicemail, a man discovering, in real time, exactly how disposable he had been to the person who hired him. There's something almost poetic about watching someone who built his entire life on using people finally get used up and discarded by one of his own. Have you ever watched someone who hurt others eventually get exactly what they built for someone else? I think there's a strange kind of justice in that. Tell me what you think in the comments. Carlotta, Desmond's mother, had invested nearly $280,000 of her own money into her son's fund, and we would later learn had known before the wedding that the fund wasn't properly licensed. Facing her own legal exposure, her attorney advised full cooperation. She gave investigators names. She admitted she'd known about prior complaints against her son. And she had gone to that wedding anyway, smiling the entire time, telling me how lucky Adaeze was. I felt something complicated when I learned that. Not simple anger, something closer to recognizing the particular shape of love braided so tightly with self-interest that, from a distance, it can almost pass for loyalty. 2 days before the formal hearing, I met Adaeze Ferreira in person for the first time, the retired nurse whose $200,000 pension had disappeared into Desmond's fund. She took Adaeze's hand across the table and said something I don't think either of us will ever forget. "I'm not here for the money," she said quietly. "I'm here for the record. If you've ever needed someone to simply believe you, not fix anything, not solve anything, just believe you, you understand exactly what that moment meant to my daughter. Let me know below if you've ever needed that kind of validation and whether you ever got it, because the hearing was 2 days away. And what happened in that courtroom would determine whether Desmond Farrow walked out a free man or whether everything he had built on other people's trust would finally collapse in front of everyone he deceived. Courtrooms have their own kind of silence, too colder than the one at the dinner party, more official, but just as heavy. I sat in the second row beside Priscilla Nakemdarim, watching Adaeze take her seat at the front without a single note card in her hand. She didn't need one. She'd been building this case in her head for weeks, the same way she once built spreadsheets that could catch a single, misplaced decimal in $1 million contract. Desmond's attorney opened first, and I want you to think about this for a second before I tell you what he said. If you were sitting in that room, having watched everything that led to this moment, how would you have felt hearing someone stand up and argue that your daughter was the aggressor, that the footage was incomplete, that a grown man defending himself against a woman half his size was somehow the injured party? I'd like to know, honestly, could you have kept your composure? I'm not sure I fully did. The attorney argued exactly that. He called Beatrix Solano's video selectively edited, despite it being 4 minutes and 17 seconds of unbroken, time-stamped footage. He called the protective order legitimate, despite it having been built entirely on Desmond's own account, filed before anyone had asked Adaeze a single question. For a moment, sitting there, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not fear exactly, but the old familiar tightening you get when you watch someone try to rewrite reality in real time, and you're not entirely sure the room will see through it. Then Priscilla was called. She laid out the financial evidence with the same clinical precision she'd used on the phone with me months earlier. The Delaware shell entity, the 41 client accounts, the $200,000 belonging to Adaeze Ferreira that no longer existed anywhere except on paper. She didn't editorialize. She didn't need to. The numbers did the work. Detective Adaeze testified next. She played the recording of Desmond's voice, just scare them enough to make them back off. And I watched several people in that courtroom, people who had known Desmond for years, physically recoil at the sound of his own voice, ordering harm against his wife and father-in-law. Then Adaeze stood. She spoke without notes, directly to the judge, laying out the $27,000 moved without her knowledge, the confrontation at the party, the 41 people who had trusted a man she had married in good faith, believing he was who he claimed to be. "I want that on the record," she said. 6 words, steady, unshaking. Have you ever had to stand in front of people and tell the truth, knowing it would be picked apart, questioned, doubted, and done it anyway? That kind of courage doesn't get talked about enough. If you've ever had to do that, even in a much smaller way, tell me about it in the comments. I mean that. I read every one of them. 4 minutes later, the ruling came down. Desmond's protective order against Adaeze vacated immediately. In its place, a 3-year restraining order granted in her favor, along with formal acknowledgement of the assault that had taken place in front of 30 witnesses. Outside the courthouse, Priscilla delivered one final piece of information that none of us had been expecting. Federal investigators had been quietly monitoring Desmond's remaining accounts for weeks, and overnight they'd caught a significant, unexplained cash withdrawal pattern, money moving in a way that suggested someone was preparing to disappear. I didn't tell Adaeze that part right away. Not to manage her, and not to protect her from it. She'd more than earned the right to know everything by that point. I held back because I'd learned, a long time ago, the difference between something imminent and something done. I wasn't going to hand her an ending before it had actually arrived. So instead, that evening, I made dinner. Something simple. Jollof rice, grilled plantain, nothing that required much thought. We sat at my kitchen table and talked about nothing that mattered at all, which, after the week we'd had, was exactly what both of us needed. Do you ever notice how, after something enormous happens, it's the smallest, quietest moments afterward that actually mean the most? A meal? A conversation about nothing? I think we underestimate how much healing happens in those ordinary moments. Let me know if you've experienced that too. I'd love to hear what that moment looked like for you. At 9:14 that night, my phone rang. Detective Achibi's name on the screen. I answered before the second ring finished. Desmond, she told me, had structured nearly $90,000 in cash withdrawals specifically to stay under federal reporting thresholds and had booked a one-way flight out of the country under the name Marlon Petrosian, the identity he'd buried years before he ever met my daughter. He had been arrested at the airport, 14 minutes before boarding, in front of dozens of strangers who had no idea they were watching the collapse of a man who had spent years learning exactly how to seem trustworthy. He hadn't resisted. I hung up the phone and looked at my daughter across the kitchen table, and I didn't know yet how to tell her that the waiting, all of it, the 5 weeks before the wedding, the silence I'd carried, the months since, was finally actually over. If you've ever waited a long time for a single phone call to change everything, you already know exactly what that silence before I spoke felt like. Tell me in the comments, have you ever waited for news that would finally set something right? Because what I said to her next would be the moment she finally let herself feel everything she'd been holding back since the night of that dinner party. I told her plainly. No easing into it, no softening the words she'd earned, the truth delivered exactly as it was. They caught him at the airport. He's not getting on a plane. It's over, Adaeze. She didn't say anything at first. She just sat there, both hands slowly coming up to cover her mouth, and I watched 30 days of held-together composure finally give way all at once. Not quiet tears. The kind that shake a person's whole body. The kind that only come out once you finally feel safe enough to let them. Have you ever held yourself together for so long through the fear, through the fighting, through pretending you were fine when you weren't, that when it was finally safe to fall apart, you almost didn't know how? I think that's one of the most human things there is. If you've ever felt that exact release, tell me about it in the comments. I promise you, someone reading this needs to know they're not the only one who's felt that. I got up from my side of the table and held her the way I used to when she was 7 years old and scared of thunderstorms. I didn't tell her it would be okay this time. I didn't need to. She already knew. The weeks that followed moved slower than the chaos before them, but they carried their own weight. Desmond was formally charged with 7 counts total state charges for criminal threatening and witness intimidation, tied to the vandalism against both Adaeze's car and my home, and federal charges for wire fraud, money laundering, and obstruction of justice, tied to Faro Strategic Holdings. The documented losses across his 41 investors came to just over $2 million. 33 of those investors were over the age of 60. I want to sit on that number for a moment, because I think it's easy to hear financial fraud and picture some faceless corporation losing money it can afford to lose. That's not what this was. That was Adaeze Ferreira's entire pension. That was 33 people's retirements, their safety nets, the money they'd spent decades building so they wouldn't have to worry in the years they had left. Has someone you know ever had their trust exploited like that, not just emotionally, but financially, by someone who was supposed to protect them? I want to hear that story too, if you're willing to share it. Titus Broadnax, the man Desmond had hired to intimidate us, ended up cooperating fully with investigators once he understood exactly how disposable he'd been to Desmond the moment the money stopped. His recorded calls became some of the strongest evidence in the federal case. A strange, almost fitting kind of irony that the man hired to silence us ended up being one of the loudest voices against the person who hired him. Ferris Okonjo Idahen, the man caught on my porch camera, took a plea deal in exchange for testimony against Broadnax. The whole structure Desmond had built, layers of people paying other people to make problems disappear, collapsed from the inside once the money supporting it dried up. It's strange watching that happen. Watching someone who spent years learning how to manipulate loyalty discover in the end that none of it was ever real loyalty at all. It was just cash flow. Months later, Adaeze filed the paperwork to take her name back. Not her married name, her mother's name, through me. She called me from outside the courthouse parking lot, and I heard something in her voice before she even said a word. The sound of someone standing in open air after a long time spent in a room with the door locked. I made sandwiches that afternoon, nothing fancy. Just something to do with my hands while she sat at my kitchen table. Quieter than I'd seen her in months, but quiet in a different way now, settled instead of braced. Beatrix Solano showed up that same afternoon, uninvited, holding a coffee cake and asking for nothing in return. When Adaeze tried to thank her, tried to explain how much that footage had meant, Beatrix just waved her off gently. "You don't need to explain it to me," she said. "You're all right now. That's all that matters." Before she left that day, Adaeze finally asked me the question I think she'd been carrying since the night in the car. The one she'd never quite found the words for until now. "You knew about the fraud before the wedding, didn't you?" It wasn't really a question. I told her the truth. "Yes." She turned her keys over slowly in her hand, thinking, and then she said something I don't think I'll ever forget. "I've thought about whether I was angry about that, and I understand why you did it. I don't know if I'd have made the same call, but I understand it." That was all I needed to hear. Not forgiveness, exactly understanding. Sometimes that's worth even more. Has anyone in your life ever made a hard, quiet decision to protect you, one you didn't find out about until much later? And when you did find out, were you angry or did you understand? I think that answer says a lot about the kind of relationship you have with that person. I'd genuinely like to know where you land on that, down in the comments. Because what I learned through all of this wasn't really about Desmond Farrow at all, in the end. It was about what it actually means to protect the people you love, and how sometimes the most important thing you can give someone isn't an answer. It's the tools to find their own. I never gave my daughter a perfect world. I couldn't. There was no version of her childhood where I could have shielded her from every hard thing waiting for her out there. And if I'm honest, I don't think that would have served her even if I could have. What I gave her, years before either of us knew why she'd ever need it, was the ability to fall without breaking, to read a room before walking into it, to stand back up when something hit her without warning. Do you think the hardest things our parents ever taught us were the ones that felt the least like lessons at the time? I think about all those early mornings in the backyard with Adaeze, teaching her how to move, how to fall safely, how to redirect force instead of absorbing it. And neither of us had any idea we were preparing for a night at a dinner party 20 years later. Tell me, is there something someone taught you a long time ago that only made sense once you actually needed it? In the months after the hearing, I found myself thinking a lot about Selassie Van Tongeren, the woman from Desmond's past, the one whose protective order had expired years before Adaeze ever met him, the one nobody had believed enough to stop him the first time. Detective Achebe reached out to her once the case became public, and I later learned that Selassie had spent years assuming nobody would ever believe her version of events, especially not after so much time had passed. When she found out that Adaeze's case had exposed the same pattern she'd lived through, she reportedly said something to Detective Achebe that stayed with me for a long time. She said she finally felt like the truth had caught up to itself, even if it had taken far longer than it should have. I think about how many people out there are carrying a version of that same feeling right now, knowing something is true, having lived it, and still wondering if anyone will ever believe them. If that's you, if you're reading this and you've ever felt like your truth was waiting for its moment to be believed, I want you to know I see you, and I'd like you to tell me about it below, if you're comfortable. This community reads every comment, and sometimes just being heard changes everything. Adaeze Ferreira, the retired nurse who had lost nearly her entire pension, ended up receiving a partial restitution order as part of the federal case. Not everything she'd lost, but enough to matter, enough to mean she wouldn't spend her final years in the financial hole Desmond had put her in. She sent Adaeze a card afterward. Simple. Handwritten. It said, "Thank you for making sure my name was on the record, even when it would have been easier for you to walk away." I keep thinking about that phrase, even when it would have been easier to walk away, because it would have been easier in almost every sense. Easier for Adaeze to quietly divorce Desmond, take her losses, and move on without ever standing in a room and naming what he'd done in front of 30 people. Easier for me to have let the SEC investigation run its course without ever getting personally involved. Neither of us took the easier road, and I don't think either of us regrets it even now. Have you ever chosen the harder path, the one that cost you more, took longer, put you at greater risk because it was simply the right thing to do? I think those choices define us more than almost anything else. Share yours with me in the comments. I want to know what it cost you and whether you'd make the same choice again. Carlotta, Desmond's mother, ultimately avoided criminal charges in exchange for her full cooperation, though she lost nearly all of the money she had personally invested in her son's fund. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she moved out of state not long after the trial concluded. I don't know what her relationship with Desmond looks like now. If she has one at all, part of me feels for her she lost her son to his own choices, in a way long before any of us ever met him. Part of me remembers her calling my daughter an attacker in front of 30 guests before she knew the whole truth. Both of those things can be true at once. That's something I've come to understand more clearly since all of this happened, that people are rarely simply villains or simply victims. Carlotta was both, in different measures, at different times. Desmond, though Desmond made his choices with open eyes, over and over again, long before he ever met my daughter, and he kept making them even after everything started to unravel. Do you think people like that, people who repeat the same pattern of harm across different relationships, different names, different cities, ever truly change? Or is it simply a matter of time before the pattern catches up with them again? I'd love to hear your honest opinion on that. It's one of the questions I still find myself turning over even now. Because as much as this story is about what Desmond did and what it cost the people around him, it's really about what came after, about what Adaeze built from the wreckage of it. And that part of the story, the part where she stopped being someone's victim and became someone's example, is the part I think matters most. A year after the trial concluded, Adaeze started volunteering with a nonprofit that helps victims of financial fraud navigate the process of reporting it, the paperwork, the investigations, the long stretches of waiting that can feel like they'll never end. She told me once that she does it because she remembers exactly how alone she felt in the early days, before Priscilla, before Detective Achebe, before any of us had proof of anything. Just her, sitting with a suspicion she couldn't yet prove, wondering if she was overreacting. Have you ever had a gut feeling about someone that turned out to be completely right, but in the moment you doubted yourself because you didn't have proof yet? I think that self-doubt is one of the most dangerous tools people like Desmond rely on, making you question your own instincts long enough that you stay quiet. If you've ever pushed past that doubt and trusted yourself anyway, I want to hear how that turned out. Tell me in the comments. I started going with her sometimes, to the intake sessions, sitting quietly in the back the way I used to sit in the back of church as a boy, listening. I never talked during those sessions. That's not my place. But I watch my daughter sit across from strangers who remind her of herself 18 months earlier, and I watch her walk them through exactly the steps that got her through it. Document everything. Don't confront until you have proof. Find the people in your life who will actually show up. There was a woman who came in during one of those sessions, maybe 2 months into the program, a widow in her 60s whose late husband's business partner had been slowly draining accounts she didn't know existed. She sat across from Adaeze, hands shaking slightly, and asked the same question I imagine every person in that chair has asked at some point. Am I overreacting? Maybe. There's an explanation. Adaeze didn't rush her. She simply said, maybe there is, but you came here because some part of you already knows there isn't. Trust that part. I sat in the back of that room and felt something I don't think I've ever fully put into words before. Pride, yes, but something quieter underneath it too. The sense that everything I'd spent 19 years learning, everything I'd once thought was locked away in a version of my life I'd left behind, had somehow found its way forward into her, and she was using it to help people I'd never even met. Do you think the hardest chapters of our lives are sometimes the ones that end up giving us the tools to help someone else through theirs? I've come to believe that almost everything difficult I've lived through eventually became useful to someone, even if it took years to see how. If you've ever turned your hardest experience into something that helped another person, I genuinely love to hear about it below. Desmond, for what it's worth, is currently serving an 11-year federal sentence, with state charges running concurrently. I've heard secondhand that he's filed multiple appeals, each one denied. I don't think about him often anymore, which surprises me given how much of my energy he consumed for almost a year of my life. But I've found that once the truth is fully on the record, once it can no longer be argued away, denied, or twisted into something more flattering for the person who caused the harm, there's a strange kind of peace that settles in. Not closure, Exactly. Something steadier than that. Selassie Van Tongeren, the woman from Desmond's past whose protective order had expired years before Adaeze ever met him, eventually reached out to Adaeze directly. They've spoken a handful of times since. Adaeze told me once that the conversation that meant the most to her wasn't about Desmond at all. It was Selassie telling her that watching someone finally believe what she'd been saying for years, even if it wasn't her own case, helped her stop feeling crazy for having said it in the first place. I think about how much harm could be prevented if we simply believed people the first time they told us something felt wrong. Not blind belief without evidence, but a willingness to actually listen, to take someone seriously enough to look closer instead of assuming they must be exaggerating. Has there ever been a moment in your life when someone finally believed you and it changed how you saw everything that came before it? I want to know. Tell me in the comments, because I think this is one of the most important questions in this entire story. Adaeze Ferreira passed away peacefully about a year and a half after the trial, from causes unrelated to any of this. Adaeze went to her funeral. She told me afterward that Odalis's daughter came up to her, held both her hands, and thanked her for making sure her mother's name was on the record before she passed, for making sure the truth outlived the woman who'd lived through it. I don't think there's a version of this story where everyone gets everything back that they lost. That's not how real life works, no matter how satisfying a clean ending might feel. But I do think there's a version where the people who did the right thing, even when it cost them, get to watch that choice ripple outward in ways they never could have predicted. If you've made it this far with me, I have one last question, and I think it might be the most important one in this whole story. What do you think we actually owe the people who come after us, the version of ourselves, or someone else entirely, who might one day face what we once faced? I'd love to know your answer before we close this out together. I think about that night in my kitchen, sometimes the one right after the arrest, when Adaeze finally let herself cry the way she'd needed to for 30 straight days. I think about how close I came, more than once, to telling her everything too early, to breaking the silence Priscilla had asked me to keep, just to spare her one more sleepless night. I didn't, and I've spent a long time since then turning over whether that was the right call. Here's what I've landed on, for whatever it's worth. Protecting the people we love doesn't always look like stepping between them and the danger. Sometimes it looks like standing quietly a few steps behind them, making sure that when the moment finally comes, they have everything they need to stand on their own. I didn't fight Desmond Farrow for my daughter. I made sure that when she decided to fight him herself, she wouldn't be fighting alone. Would you have made the same choice I did, staying silent for 5 weeks to build a case instead of warning her the moment you found out? Or would you have told her immediately, consequences to the investigation aside? I still don't know with complete certainty that I chose correctly. I only know that it worked, and I'm not sure those are the same thing. I'd like to know which way you'd have gone and why. Some of the most honest conversations in this community have come out of questions just like this one. Adaeze still keeps her mother's pearl earrings in the same small box they've always lived in. She wore them to the wedding. She wore them again, a year later, to the small courthouse ceremony where she officially took back her mother's name. I stood beside her both times, in the same rented tuxedo, watching the same light catch the same pearls, and thinking about how much can change in the space between two moments that look almost identical from the outside. She's engaged again now to a man named Adaeze, who I've come to trust in a way that took me a long time to extend to anyone after everything that happened. Not because he's perfect, nobody is, but because he asks questions instead of assuming answers, and because the first time I met him, he didn't ask me a single thing about what Adaeze stood to inherit. He asked me what she was like as a little girl. That told me more about him than any background check ever could have. Do you think we ever fully stop being cautious after something like this happens to someone we love? I don't think I have, not completely, and I'm not sure I want to. A little vigilance, worn lightly, isn't the same thing as living in fear. I think there's a version of caution that actually comes from love, not from damage. I'd be curious whether you feel the same way, based on whatever you've lived through yourself. I don't do the work I used to do anymore. That part of my life is genuinely finished, and I'm at peace with that. But I've come to understand that the skills from that life were never really about the work itself. They were about attention, about noticing the person who watches the exit door a beat too long during their own wedding vows, about trusting the small, uncomfortable detail that doesn't fit, even when everyone else in the room is too polite or too hopeful or too in love to notice it. I think most people have that instinct somewhere inside them, whether or not they've ever had formal training in anything at all. We just get taught over and over to talk ourselves out of it, to assume we're overreacting, to give people the benefit of the doubt long after the doubt has stopped being reasonable. If there's one thing I hope you take from everything I've shared with you across this story, it's this: trust the detail that doesn't fit. Trust the version of the story that makes you uncomfortable enough to actually look closer, even when it would be so much easier to look away. Adaeze Ferreira didn't get her whole pension back. Selassie Van Tongeren spent years not being believed before anyone finally listened. But Adaeze stood in a room full of people and told the truth anyway. And that truth outlived every lie Desmond Pharaoh ever told to build the life he thought he was entitled to. I believe the right people end up in the right places when it matters most. A neighbor by a window with her phone still recording. An old colleague who answers a call at 10 o'clock at night. A 71-year-old woman who simply wanted her name on the record. None of that was an accident. Family betrayal doesn't always arrive as a stranger. Sometimes it walks in wearing a borrowed smile and a good suit and cries convincingly during its own wedding vows. And sometimes the quiet person standing in the back of the room has been preparing for that exact moment for a very long time, without either of you ever knowing that's what they were doing. Pay attention to the people who show up quietly. In my experience, they're usually the ones who matter most. If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with me while I lived through it, I'd love to know what part of it will you still be thinking about tomorrow. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and I'll see you in the next story.